Howdy my totally tubular gamers, and we are back for the spooky special, and today's spooky ranking video is going to be on the Alone in the Dark series. For those that don't know, Alone in the Dark was a game originally released in 1992 and is widely considered the forefather of the entire survival horror genre of video games. Games like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and Fatal Frame owe a lot, if not almost everything, to Alone in the Dark. To say that that original game is very influential would be an understatement, and there are plenty of horror games that release nowadays with Alone in the Dark's DNA still in it. Literally, it was a genre-defining game. But after such a revolutionary game, what happened to the series? What happened to Alone in the Dark after that initial big release? Obviously, other games like Resident Evil came in and pretty much just swept it under the rug, but some people were left wondering, what ever happened to Alone in the Dark? Well, don't worry. I know exactly what happened to the series. To say Alone in the Dark has had a rocky history over the last 20 or so years of gaming, kind of be an understatement. It's really been all over the place. It's been so all over the place that a lot of people just act like no other Alone in the Dark game really exists after that initial one that was so genre defining. But not me. We're going to be looking at all of the Alone in the Dark games. Yep, all of them. I thought, what better time than now during October than to rank all of the Alone in the Dark games. What are the best Alone in the Dark games that you might have never heard of, and what are the worst that you should absolutely avoid? And who knows, maybe one day we'll have another game, but for now we're just looking at all the games that are out currently. We're going to be ranking these games based on a couple criteria. How well does the game hold up? How easy it is to play nowadays? Is it scary? Does it have a good atmosphere? Maybe a decent story? Is the game actually even any good? The answers might surprise you. I've also reviewed all these games before, like really in depth, 20 plus minutes for just about every single one. Have a link in the description to a video with all of them combined. This obviously won't be anywhere near as in depth, but we're going to be ranking all the Alone in the Dark games from worst to best and everything in between. So with that out of the way, please like, share, sub, comment, all that stuff. Let's get right into it. What is the worst of the worst? What's the worst Alone in the Dark game? The worst is easily Alone in the Dark Illumination, which actually happens to be the most recent Alone in the Dark game. Now, I don't have all that much experience with this game, and you don't need much experience with this game because this game is awful. The game has basically nothing to do with the other Alone in the Dark games, or if it does, it's a very tiny connection. The game is essentially a Left 4 Dead style horde shooter where you just kind of go through these levels and get bombarded by enemies and have to do tasks together and try to survive in co-op fashion. So let me reiterate that this series is called Alone in the Dark, like alone. Whoever was making this game clearly did not get the message, but this game is terrible anyway. It's one of the jankiest games I've ever played. There's bugs everywhere. The game crashed a bunch of times. Glitches galore. The shooting doesn't work a lot of the time. Sound effects are missing. It runs like crap. The optimization is about as bad as it gets. The game is just the definition of dead. Like, I'm pretty sure the game was dead on release. Like, it looked bad before it came out, and it is bad. It's sad that the series ended this way, and hopefully this is not forever, because this game is garbage. Don't recommend it to anybody, and it's better to just ignore that it ever existed. The next game we have is simply titled Alone in the Dark. This is the infamous 2008 reboot of the series by Atari. The game is widely regarded as probably one of the worst reboots in video game history, and with good reason, because this game is not very good. I have an entire 40-minute video dissecting this game of why it's not good in just about every single aspect, but I'll just hit some of the bullet points here. The plot of this game is just completely all over the place. It tries to connect to the original Alone in the Dark, tries to do its own thing. Your main character has amnesia and doesn't remember anything. All hell is breaking loose. There's earthquakes and fissures all over these hell demons. Really, it seems like the end of the world, I guess, and Edward Carnby, the main character, is just like, what the fuck is even going on? The story is needlessly convoluted. It has some really stupid plot twists. It doesn't really go anywhere, and the ending is just laughably bad.
I'm the light bringer. I'm the fucking universe. Fucking universe. Fucking universe.
It's probably one of the stupidest plots in any video game I've ever seen. but it is absolutely hilarious. It is definitely so bad that it's good. And I frequently found myself laughing at the characters and their delivery and really just what was going on.
Give me my stone. I don't have your stone, and fuck you anyway.
The gameplay is really the developers throwing everything at the wall and hoping something sticks. Like, it is just a complete clusterfuck with a terrible beat-em-up system, worse shooting, bad survival elements, a blinking mechanic, needless crafting, bad driving, and the list goes on and on. None of it's done well. The gameplay feels very unfocused, unrefined, and all around just isn't very fun to play. The game's sure as hell not scary. I mean, it is funny, and it does have some interesting mechanics thrown in there, like the fire mechanic. However, just like the rest of the gameplay, it's not really all that defined, and it's not really all that well thought out. They just basically were like, hey, what's popular in the mid-2000s? Oh, this is, put it in. Bad platforming, clunky movement, poorly implemented light system, it just goes on, and I'll be here another 40 minutes if I keep talking about this game. So all I'm going to say is I don't recommend it. I do recommend my long-ass video on it, though, because this game is hilarious, and yeah, it's just not very good. Our next game is Alone in the Dark 2, One-Eyed Jack's Revenge, which was also released on the PlayStation and Saturn. The game takes place right after the first Alone in the Dark and still stars Edward Carnby. This time it sees him going to a estate looking for this girl that's gone missing known as Grace. The plot of the game is surprisingly well done, and it actually is really fleshed out with some strong villains and some interesting characters. The game has some really nice backgrounds. A lot of the still images look pretty alright and have a fair amount of detail in them. And while we're talking positively about the game, the music in this game is awesome. It's really well done. There's a lot of catchy tunes. A lot of it sets the mood. I really like the music of this game. And that's about all I can say positively about Alone in the Dark 2. See, when it comes to the gameplay, the developers just did not understand what made the original Alone in the Dark so special, like, at all, because they dropped a lot of the great aspects of it, and what we have here is a very mediocre to bad game. The game dropped all semblance of horror and a lot of the survival elements, and tries to favor a more action-style approach, which does not work at all in this game's favor. In the original Alone in the Dark, the weakest aspect was easily the combat, so what did the developers focus on for the sequel? Combat. You engage in combat more than you do anything else in this game. Forget solving those interesting puzzles or exploring around the world. No, you're getting involved in combat in this game, and it really is bad. Tank controls have their place in video games. Obviously they do, but this is not the right setting for them. It controls terribly, it's very clunky, aiming is just terrible, and you engage in way too many enemies at once. Edward is very cumbersome and will frequently get locked into stun animations that will just lead you to dying really quickly. Like, the amount of times you get stun locked in this game has got to be like some record. The game is overly punishing, it is brutally difficult at the start and leaves a terrible first impression, and the combat just doesn't flow well at all. Besides the bad combat, there are some very poorly implemented stealth segments where you play as Grace, the little girl. These, less said about them the better. The puzzles are nowhere near as good as the original game. A lot of them are just way too obtuse 90s puzzles for anyone, really. Like, if you don't have a walkthrough, good luck. But I don't recommend a walkthrough for this game because I don't recommend this game, period. It totally falls flat as a sequel, doesn't understand really anything about the original Alone in the Dark, and just made me scratch my head like, what were they thinking with this game? Our next game is a little better. It's Alone in the Dark 3. So Alone in the Dark 3 takes place after 2 and sees Edward Carnby still as a private investigator. This time he's tasked with going to a movie set because the whole crew goes missing, including Emily Hartwood, one of the playable characters from the first game. The movie that they were filming was a Wild West themed movie, so they created a Wild West town and everything. However, when you get there, it's all abandoned and, well, there's some spooky shit going on here. While I think the initial setup and premise is actually better than the second game and more aligned with what made the OG Alone in the Dark good, the plot unfortunately doesn't go anywhere interesting and it really is kind of boring and just fizzles out by the end of it. The gameplay is much more like a survival horror game with a much less emphasis on combat. The combat is still there, it's still pretty bad, but it's not as ridiculous as the second game, and it's not a majority of the game. A majority of the game is exploring the environment, solving puzzles, and figuring out just what the hell's going on. The atmosphere was actually really well done, and I really liked what they did when it came to exploring the environment. I thought the puzzles were decent enough. They weren't great or anything, but they were fine. And the combat luckily doesn't rear its head too much. I mean, most of it really is like hand to hand, which was always better than the gun crap. Something that does rear its ugly head, though, is platforming. Yes, this game actually has platforming in it, and it is bad. It is really bad. While most of the puzzles are fine enough, there was like one or two in here where I'm just like, how the hell was anybody supposed to know that? Like where you put the bullet in the keyhole and then the hammer to the bullet. Like, no, nobody would have known to do that normally. And there's a few times where it's just not clear what's background and what's an item you can actually pick up. Like, there's just not a very good distinction. The graphics were very by the numbers for the time. Like, I mean, look at it. It's an old game, no shit. And the music is pretty underrated. Alone in the Dark 3 gets talked about less than 1 and 2, and I don't really know why that is. I think it's better than 2, but I still wouldn't say it's all that good. I mean, it's okay, but it's not really better than okay. I mean, I would have a hard time recommending this game. This is one where I can say, unless you're like a survival horror or horror game enthusiast, you're really not going to get anything from this game. Everyone else can probably just skip it. And for the second best Alone in the Dark game, we have the original Alone in the Dark. Yep, the 92 classic. And it's clear that the developers really had lightning in a bottle with this game and really made some magic. And it's clear that the lightning did not strike twice. The original Alone in the Dark has aged. I mean, obviously it's aged. Look at it. The graphics are primitive. Some of the interfaces are very clunky. To do stuff, you have to go into a menu. Of course it's aged. But beyond that, I still think that the game is absolutely great. The core gameplay, the gameplay loop, has absolutely aged marvelously because it's still the same gameplay loop that is used even nowadays in horror games, where you're investigating areas, collecting items, managing resources, and occasionally getting into combat. The atmosphere that this original game has is actually very well done. The primitive graphics, I think, work to the game's favor, as you have to actually use your imagination for some of this, as corny as that sounds, and the imagination is way scarier than what a game from the 90s could do. The game's story and premise is quite simple, and it works to the game's favor, where it's just about the player going into this mansion and figuring out what the hell's going on, and some spooky, deep shit goes down, and I'm gonna just leave it at that because it's actually really well done. The game has a great sense of exploration. I really liked all the environments. They're all really well made. The puzzles are maybe the best in like the whole series, really. They're actually quite good. They're all really well thought out, and you don't even need like a walkthrough for any of them. They're all decently basic. The atmosphere is very foreboding. You can still feel the game's atmosphere despite the aged graphics. The music is very well done. It's very tense. The game feels tense, and it really just shows that they just totally struck a chord with this game. However, I will say not all of the game is excellent. Towards the end of the game, there are a few parts that are questionable, to say the least. There's a really bad platforming sequence. There's a really stupid maze, and really just the last like 20 to 45 minutes, maybe even an hour of the game, really is the low point of the entire game, and it kind of abandons what the first 3/4 of the game is. However, this is just the very end of the game. I think the first, 3/4 of the game are great. I think that anyone who likes survival horror games can pick this up and understand it pretty quickly, and will get past the game's clunkiness rather quickly, as it's pretty easy to understand and it is manageable. It's a shame the combat is not good, like in any aspect. It's aged very poorly. I don't think anybody's going to think this is good. Even for the time, it wasn't good. It's just bad. Alone in the Dark, though, is still a certified classic. It is still a very good game. I can easily recommend it to anybody who likes horror games, and it should be played by anybody who considers themselves a huge fan of the genre. But I can say what Alone in the Dark, this original game, needs more than anything else is it needs a remake. I don't care if it's in first or third person or the original camera angles, it just needs a real ass remake, like from the ground up, brand new with modern graphics. I think that would really benefit the game, and I think that it would bring the game into a new light that a lot of people haven't seen. And it'd probably get called a Resident Evil clone, which is pretty funny. But until that happens, we have this original game, which I can recommend. And here we have Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare, which is what I believe to be the best Alone in the Dark game and one of the most underrated horror games of all time. Alone in the Dark, New Nightmare really looks at what made the original Alone in the Dark great in the first place and essentially recreates it for a new era. This new era was the early 2000s, and it was competing against Resident Evil and Silent Hill, and naturally this was a bit slept on compared to those, but I still think that this is a very solid horror game. The game sees Edward and new character Elaine head to Shadow Island, no connection to Metal Gear. And here they investigate just what the hell's going on, and there's a bunch of other spooky shit I'm not going to get into. The story is actually quite good in this game, and Elaine and Carnby split up a number of times, and you get to actually play as either one of them. You get to choose at the beginning of the game, and both of them go through almost totally different stories. Like, yeah, they have a few beats that are together, but these are basically two different stories. It's to the point that if you want to experience the game, you really do actually have to play it twice, because there are a bunch of sequences that say Edward goes through that Elaine does not. The gameplay is your pretty standard run-of-the-mill survival horror game. However, Alone in the Dark was the series that kind of created that entire formula to begin with, so it makes sense that they would heavily rely on it. It's still a fixed camera perspective, it's got tank controls, and you get to explore around this big mansion and the yards around the mansion, get into combat, and occasionally solve some puzzles while you're just kind of trying to figure out what's going on here. It really doesn't feel all that dated, and it has aged pretty well. I mean, it's aged even better than some of the older Resident Evils, I feel. The tank controls aren't annoying, and the combat is actually pretty well done. I mean, it's fine enough. It's nothing amazing or that's going to blow your mind, but it is so much better than anything that's been on this list before this game. The puzzles are definitely the best in the series. A lot of these are creative and actually provide some decent thinking about it, and they aren't too obtuse to the point where I'm just getting the walkthrough immediately. I like the puzzles here, and I genuinely liked exploring the island. I thought that it was really interesting, and I thought the atmosphere was actually exceptionally well done. It is the best atmosphere in all the games, and it's one of the best atmospheres or at least vibes I've gotten from a horror game. Like, I felt the dread, I felt everything it was putting out, I was picking up what it was putting down. I actually really liked the atmosphere, the setting, and the graphics. I thought that these backgrounds were great for the time, they look great, they still look pretty cool nowadays, and they haven't aged all that badly. The presentation as a whole was actually really well done, the voice acting was actually pretty decent, it was better than anything Capcom did around this time, and I think that this is a really underrated gem. No, it doesn't invent the wheelhouse, it isn't super innovative for the horror genre, and it didn't do anything that you really haven't seen before, but what I think it does very well, and again, you gotta remember, Alone in the Dark kind of created this, so it makes sense that it would follow in its own footsteps and retread on what made the original game so good. This game really captures what made that original game great, and just has a new version of it that's much easier to come back to. I think the game was just drastically overlooked and slept on forever, really, and I think that the people who played it, who remember it, still really enjoy it, and I think that anybody who likes horror games absolutely should try this, because it's Alone in the Dark at its best, when you are, as the title implies, alone in the dark. Like, that's really when it's at its best. And it's a shame that some of these other games really failed to remember what made Alone in the Dark great. And that's it for Alone in the Dark. I mean, you want to know why nobody really talks about Alone in the Dark after that first game? It's because a lot of the other games are pretty questionable. I think the only ones really worth playing are Alone in the Dark and Alone in the Dark New Nightmare. Everything else can pretty much just be skipped nowadays. But hey, it was still fun to do this ranking list. Let me know your favorite in the comments below. Everyone have a great night. See ya.